Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Chris Padden, and I want to personally thank you for joining us today. And today, I wanted to share a set of ideas that you don't really hear discussed very often in testing circles. It's not because that they're new, but because that they're so common that most teams stop noticing them. And it's kind of like the hum of a nearby freeway. You stop hearing it after a while, even though that it's always there in the background. And most teams, they don't really even understand that they're operating inside of these patterns, and yet they spend an enormous amount of time trying to manage the system or the symptoms that these patterns produce. And there's names for these symptoms. You have, for example, maintenance and flaky tests and instability and brittle automation. But these are just the symptoms. And so what I want to explore today is something that goes a little bit deeper. It's a form of structural decay, if you will, that it quietly accumulates inside test ecosystems over time. And my goal isn't just to describe it. I want to actually show it to you. I want to show you how to recognize it. I want to show you how to measure it and how to address it in a fundamentally different way. But I must warn you, once you see this, you can't unsee it. So today we're going to we're going to discuss where automation reuse stops, and then we're going to talk about what variation is and how it grows over time. Uh, we're going to talk about the how structure affects maintenance and flakiness. And then we're going to do a live experiment in a real ecosystem. And you're probably wondering how we're going to do that. So you'll have to wait and see. And then we're going to go ahead and wrap it up with we're going to take a different look at how to use reuse, how to how to look at reuse is what I should say. So, but before I get started, I just wanted to say a quick word about LogiGear. So LogiGear is a software testing company. We've been around for more than 30 years now. Um, and we deliver just about every type of testing service there is, but our focus has always been test automation. In fact, we actually created our own methodology called action-based testing. And one of the core principles is that reusability it should be implemented at every level. But what we find is that that's definitely not the case out there in the field. So when we go out and we speak with customers, we see that most of them are using page objects, and page objects is definitely the solution for at the UI level because it helps um, it helps teams centralize UI's interactions and it helps them reuse them. So if a button changes in, if a button changes, you don't have to fix it in like 50 different places. But what we don't see is the reuse of workflows or test logic or even business behavior. So what we're seeing is that reuse literally stops at the UI layer. But at the test layer, we're seeing business flows, we're seeing them being rebuilt um, independently. And so while at the UI layer, while UI interactions are being reused, actual business flows are being duplicated, and that becomes variation. So the question is what is variation? Well, here you have three tests, and they're all accomplishing essentially the same thing, but each one implements the same workflow slightly differently. So how does that happen? Well, you basically, the business they have a certain business process that they need to validate, and that's what they're doing here in test A, which is the original. But then over time, someone on the same team or someone from a different team, they have a similar requirement, and they have to, well, rather than build it from scratch, what they do is they just reuse what's already available. But what they do is they simply they reuse this workflow and they add something, they modify it just slightly. And so you get this like filtering. Um, but what it what's happening here is this is the start of um, this is basically where the start of change happens. And then this when you reuse that what happens is this gets reproduced over time, over and over and over again. And so rather than um, so eventually what happens is instead of one having just one version of the checkout process, now you have 20 different versions of it. So this is where maintenance creep really comes from. You start with a core workflow, and then somebody adds filtering to it. And then after that, somebody adds guest checkout, and someone adds coupon handling and so forth. But each time they add a shortcut, they actually add a new branch. And and that's when something changes, you no longer have just one workflow to update, you have many. So one login change suddenly impacts test A, test B, test C, and so on. And this is the operational impact of uncontrolled variation. And the problem isn't login itself. The problem is that the ownership of this particular workflow is fragmented across the entire test suite. So one change spreads everywhere. And so this is a scenario that many of you might be used to or have experienced yourselves. There's a change to login, and then you go and you test that, and the test passes, but then you test it again, and the test fails. And then the next morning you test it again, it passes, and then it fails again. Well, this is known as a flaky test, and sometimes it's very difficult to pinpoint what's causing the instability. Um, but teams spend an enormous amount of time trying to debug this. But what if it's the result of the same business goal being implemented differently, like we saw in the previous slides? What if somebody's taking the workflow and then they're changing it just slightly? So maybe somebody's adding different weights, or somebody's adding, different navigation paths or different validation logic. Basically, each and every one of these produces a different outcome. So what appears to be, a random or what appears to be random is may sometimes just be structural variation revealing itself. So so what we've been looking at is the actual structural problem underneath most unstable automation suites. There's no single owner, there's no single definition, and there's no single update point. What you have though is you have the same business workflow being expressed through multiple implementations. And that's why some tests are flaky, and that's why test suites tend to become difficult to maintain. So, okay, I see there's a poll here. That will be interesting for to see how people answer that one. Um, so everything that we looked at so far has been conceptual, but it raises the question, if workflow duplication is structural, then how would you actually observe it in a real automation ecosystem? And so that's what we're going to go ahead and do now. Let's see here. Okay, so what we have here is this is a Playwright test script that somebody posted here on GitHub. And when you look at it, you can see that it's actually a pretty well-structured test. It uses page objects, it uses data-driven testing, and it separates the test data from the test logic. So, but let's see what would happen if we were to analyze it with a tool that we created for structural analysis. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this, and then I'm going to go over to the tool, and I'm going to paste it right here. Okay, so here we have the test script, and we're going to go ahead and run an analysis. So, oops. So while this analysis is running, let me kind of explain what the tool's doing and what it's not doing. So it's not evaluating, the code quality, or it's not measuring coverage or anything like that. What it's doing is it's observing workflow patterns, and it's trying to identify variation. And it's also trying to estimate, how future changes are likely to propagate through the ecosystem. So, essentially, it's an architectural view of how automation is structured. And okay, so here we can see that it is completed, and the result is that it found three duplicated implementations of user authentication. And if I drop down here, we can see that these are the three different workflows, and they're all connected. And we've assigned a percentage to it. So what this is showing is that roughly 85% of these tests are the same. So they're pretty much derivatives of each other. And this kind of goes back and supports what I showed you in the previous slides, how, companies or teams are changing the workflow just slightly. And but the problem is this is oops, the problem is that this is a good candidate for a flaky test. Now, what happens when a change occurs to user authentication? So when a change happens, it's definitely going to affect or impact all three of these tests, and so you're going to have to go in and update each one of these tests. And that's not really a big concern. Nobody really worries about three tests, but the bigger question is what happens if this pattern is if we find this pattern in this test, how many other tests will this pattern show up in, and in how many different locations? So that's the real question. The other question, though, is how do we avoid this? Because after all, it's kind of silly not to be able to reuse workflows, right? I mean, no, but teams are under pressure. They have to meet deadlines. It just seems ridiculous not to be able to reuse workflows, and the difference is to do it in a controlled way versus the how most teams are doing it, which is in an uncontrolled way. So we're going to take a look at how to do it in a controlled way. So we'll go back up here. So in the beginning, I told you how in our testing practice, we implement reusability at every level. So that includes the workflows themselves, not just the UI interactions underneath them. And really that changes the structure completely, because now you have just one workflow. You have one owner, one definition, and one update point. And let's see here, instead of having to go and rebuild, instead of having every test go and rebuild a workflow independently, now all they do is they consume a shared workflow definition. And that means that, when there's a change, it's when something changes, you can update it, or the update is contained to really just one location or one place, across the entire test suite. So variation never really disappears completely, and nor should it. Businesses, they still have different users, they still have different products and different payment methods, etc. But now variation is introduced through inputs or arguments rather than rebuilding an entirely new workflow. And so, the workflow never changes, only the data changes, and that's a massive difference operationally. Another way to Another way to look at this, I always like to use analogies, but imagine, an airport. An airport has hundreds of planes landing and taking off onto shared runways. So each plane is coming and going from different destinations, and that's what these arguments represent. It represents versatility. So there's like no limitation to this workflow. You can add versatility by using all these different arguments and whatnot. So, but the difference is, again, going back to the airport analogy, is that the airport really only has to maintain a handful of runways, and that's the same case with test automation. So the bottom line is, if you don't reuse workflows, you're rebuilding them essentially. And every time you rebuild, you're introducing more variation. And so that variation, it's going to spread until maintenance becomes uncontrollable. And so the real goal really isn't just reuse, it's containment. Because once change is contained, automation becomes more stable and more scalable. So the real question is, it's not, do we have reuse? The real question is at which layer or which level does reuse stop? So that concludes my presentation. I hope you guys found it insightful. I do want to say, we can go ahead and open it up for Q&A, but I also wanted to share with you that, if you wanted to run this structural analysis tool in your own environment, we're happy to send you a link. All you need to do is just go ahead and send me an email, and I'll go ahead and I'll email you the link. Also, if you're interested in learning more about building reusable workflows, especially with AI, then I we're going to be, my colleague here is going to be hosting a webinar at the end of the month, and I think we're going to paste that up in the chat area. But that should be a really good webinar as well.